In this beginner tutorial, I'll show you how to use object modifiers for beginners. So object modifiers can be added to objects when you're 3D modeling to help you with the modeling process. But what's so useful about modifiers is that they adapt to the object as you're modeling them. And they can allow you to do some really cool things and add some really cool effects to your objects, which would be really hard to do if you were just 3D modeling it by hand. And if you'd like to download the free project files with all of these different modifier examples, then I'll have this Blender file as a free download on my Gumroad store and Patreon page with the links in the description. You can go inside the Blender file and just take a look at all the 3D models and take a look at the modifiers. And if you're downloading on Gumroad, you can just put in 0 into the price box and then download for free. Or if you'd like to send me a little tip to help support this channel, you can just punch in $1 or $2 into the price box before downloading, and that's a great way to help support this channel. Now, if you're a complete beginner to Blender, then I'd highly recommend checking out my Blender for Complete Beginners tutorial series. And throughout the tutorial series, I show you all the basics of Blender. And I also have a Blender Beginner Fundamentals tutorial playlist where I teach you different fundamentals in Blender, like lighting for beginners, 3D modeling for beginners, compositing for beginners, sculpting for beginners, and so many more different fundamentals of Blender. And these free tutorials are made possible thanks to my amazing supporters. So if you'd like to join my supporters in helping out this channel, a great way to do that is by checking out my Gumroad store and my Patreon page and the YouTube memberships. So on my Patreon page, you'll be helping to support the channel monthly and you'll get access to lots of Blender content. Or if you'd like to make a one-time purchase of one of my products, my Gumroad store is a great place to do that. Or if you'd like to help support the channel here on YouTube and get some cool perks here on YouTube, you can check out the YouTube join button below this video. So thank you all so much for your support. So here we are in a new scene in Blender, and I'm currently using the latest stable version of Blender as I record this video, which is Blender 4.4.1. I'm also going to have my screencast keys right down here in the corner so you can see what buttons I'm pressing. So the first modifier which I'm going to show you, which is a very common, you'll use it all the time, is the mirror modifier. So what I'm going to do is add a modifier which will actually mirror one side of the mesh over to the other side of the mesh. And this is so useful when you're modeling many things because so many things are symmetrical in the real world. So humans are symmetrical, animals are symmetrical, cars and most other vehicles are symmetrical, and so many other things in the real world are symmetrical. So the first thing that I need to do is delete half of this object so that we can actually add a mirror modifier. So if I hit the tab key, that's going to go into edit mode, and then I'm going to add a loop cut by pressing Ctrl R. So there's the loop cut, that yellow line there. So I'm going to left click and then right click so the loop cut stays in the center. Now what I'm going to do is just select this vertex and then hold down the shift key and select these other vertices. And I'm going to hit X to delete, and we're going to delete the vertices. And also if I go back to object mode by hitting tab, you can see the origin point, which is that little orange dot there. The origin point is in the very center. So now what I'm going to do is click over here to go to the modifier properties. So there's going to be an add modifier button, so I can click on this, and now there's going to be some different options here. So there's different categories. So there's ways to edit the mesh, there's ways to like generate things on the mesh. You can also deform the mesh. So they're sorted into these categories, but there's also a search here, and I prefer just to use the search because it's a lot easier than going through and looking for all the modifiers. So I'm going to click on the search, or if you click on add modifier, you can just immediately start to type. So I can just start to type MIR for mirror, and then I can click on the mirror modifier. And you can see the icon there kind of looks like a butterfly, so I'll click on mirror, and now you can see the half of the cube is back here on the other side. So now this mirror modifier is this little like square here, and there's a bunch of different settings that you can change on the mirror modifier. Now what is so useful about this is that if I hit the tab key to go back into edit mode, I can select some of the mesh, and I can hit G to grab, or I can hit S to scale, or R to rotate, and it is going to mirror exactly what is on this side over to the other side. So for example, if I like selected this face here, let's go to the face select and select this face. I can hit E to extrude and extrude out the face. I can select this face and hit E to extrude and extrude out the face, and it's going to mirror it perfectly over to the other side. Now something that's important to note is that it's going to mirror it from the origin point, because that's where it sees the center of the object. So if I hit the A key to select all the mesh and then hit like G to grab and drag it over here, you can see now the origin point is there in the center, so there's going to be a gap here. Also, if I go back into object mode and then hit G to grab and maybe move the whole entire object over on the y-axis, you can see it's still going to mirror from the center of the origin, not the center of the world. So if I hit tab to go into edit mode, if I want to bring this back into the center of the world, you can now see it's kind of inverting it because it's mirroring it from that origin point. So I'm going to hit Control Z just to undo undo that. So it's going to mirror it from the center of the origin point. Now there are also some different settings on the mirror modifier. So there's going to be the different axes. So there is the x-axis, which is the red line, there's the y-axis, which is the green line, and then there's the z-axis, which is up and down. And if I hit 1 on the numpad to go to front view, you can see there's that blue line for the z-axis. So you can click on the x, the y, and the z for which way you want it to be mirrored on. So what I'm going to do is hit Control Z just to undo this, and then I will turn on the x-axis. So it's mirroring it back and forth on the x. However, let's say that I also wanted to mirror it on the z and the y. What I could do is hit Tab to go into edit mode. I could hit Control R and then left click and right click so the loop stays there, and then hit Control R and left click and right click so the loop cut stays in the center. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the face select, and I'm going to click and drag to select these faces, and I'll hit X and delete faces. And then I can also click and drag to select these faces, and I'll hit X and delete faces. So what I'm going to do real quick is click on this exit here to get rid of the modifier. So you can see now this is only like a quarter of the cube. It's only this little corner, but we need to mirror it over here and over here. So if I click on add modifier and type in MIR and then hit enter to add mirror, I can mirror on the x-axis, the y-axis, the z-axis, or all three of them at once. So this way, if I hit tab to go into edit mode, we can go to the vertex select this vertex, and I can hit G to grab and move it around, and it's going to mirror it on all of the other axes. So it's mirroring it on the X, Y, and Z. So for example, this would be really useful if you were modeling like some sort of sci-fi cube, maybe like a sci-fi crate. You could like add a bevel here. You could like inset this face, maybe inset this down. Maybe you could like add some loop cuts, select these and kind of inset them and extrude them back here. And you can see already I'm getting a really detailed object because I don't have to model the entire thing. I can just model one side, and that's going to mirror it all the way over to the other sides. And this is of course very useful if you're modeling like a character or a creature or a vehicle or really anything that's symmetrical. It'll totally speed up the process and improve your modeling because you only have to model one side. Now there are also some other buttons right here on top of the modifier. So I'm going to talk about these buttons. So this button right here, this is called on cage. And if I click on this, that is going to show me the geometry on the other side. So it almost appears as though the mirror modifier isn't there. But if I click on this side, I can now hit G to grab and move it around instead of just clicking on this corner. However, if I hit G to grab and try to drag it farther away, because it's inverted, because this is actually the object I'm selected, or this is the piece I'm selecting, it's actually dragging it into the cube instead of farther away. But that can be very useful if you just want to work on one side and you don't want to just use this other side. So with the on cage turned off, I can't actually select this other side of the mirror because this is the only geometry. But with the on cage on, it's basically going to act as though this is actual geometry, but the mirror modifier will still be in effect. This button right here, this is edit mode. So this is going to display it in edit mode. So if I turn this off, now the mirror modifier is gone. But if I hit tab to go back to object mode, the mirror modifier is still going to be there. So this might not seem that useful, but when you're working on like really complex projects, this is actually very useful because there might be some modifiers which kind of get in the way of your modeling. And so you might not want to actually go into edit mode and like do some really precise modeling and then go back out of edit mode and go back into object mode. And then the mesh still has the modifier applied. Now this button here is like a monitor icon, and this is just going to hide it from the viewport. So whether you're in object mode or edit mode, it's going to hide it from the viewport, but when you actually render the 3D scene, it'll still show up. And then the last button is the camera icon, and this is going to do the opposite of the viewport one. So this one will hide it just from the render. So you can actually still see the modifier in the viewport, but in the render it's just going to be hidden. So you might occasionally use these buttons here and there, but for most things you probably just won't use these buttons. Another thing you can do is you can rename the modifiers in case you have lots of modifiers. So if I click on the modifier, I could type in modifier cube 1, and then this way if I click on add modifier and search for another mirror modifier, you can see now we have another one underneath this one. And so this one I could call mirror modifier 2. Also, if you have a huge modifier stack with lots of modifiers, you can click on the arrows here just to minimize it, and that way it just kind of looks more clean and neat because you can't see all the settings. You can also click on the exit button here if you want to delete a modifier. So click on the X there to delete it. Now also you can reorganize the modifier stack. So for example, if I just add another mirror modifier, let's say that this mirror modifier was like doing something different, I could click right here on these little dots here, the little corner there, and drag up and then drop it here. And this way you would use the first mirror modifier first and then the second mirror modifier next. So basically it works in order from top to bottom. So it does the effect of the first modifier, and then the next one, and then the next one. And so I'll actually be showing you later in this video why that's useful, because if you reorder the modifiers, that can make the object look very different. And then finally, there's also this little arrow here. So if I click on this is just going to have a few more settings. So you can apply the modifier. You can also duplicate the modifier, so it's going to be duplicated. You can also like move it to last, so that's going to drag it down, but I want to keep it up here. And then the last option is to pin it. So if you pin it, it's going to make sure the modifier always stays at the very bottom of the modifier stack. But most of the time you won't really have to use these drop-down settings. However, the one that you'll use the most out of all these settings is the apply setting. So this is very useful. So if I just go into edit mode, let's just like go to the face select this face, we can extrude the face, maybe scale the face. And then let's say that I want to apply the modifier because I'm done modeling it and I want to add something else here on this side which isn't mirrored. Well, what I can do is now apply this. So if I go back to object mode, you have to go back into object mode. Then I can click on the drop down and click on apply, or the shortcut key is Control A with the mouse hovered over the modifier. So now that I've applied it, if I go into edit mode, this is all actual geometry, so I can move this around and it's not going to affect the other side. So now I could like extrude this out here, extrude this out, and because we applied the mirror modifier, it's not going to mirror on the other side. So basically there might be a point in your modeling process where you realize that you've modeled enough of the mirror and you need to apply it so that you can add more details which are on the other side. I'm just going to hit Control Z though, just to kind of undo these options here. So let's just hit Control Z. Now, one more really important setting with the mirror is there is this clipping option. So if I click on clipping, what that's going to do is going to merge these vertices here together, which are in the very center of the mirror. So if the clipping is turned off, I can hit G to grab and move this apart. And this is a problem because let's say that I want to model this, but keep the insides merged, so the parts which are connected. Well, if I turn on clipping, I can hit G to grab and drag them together. And then when I drag them apart, they're going to be squished together or connected. So it's almost like you're gluing the edges together. So then when I drag this apart, it's not going to fall apart. The cube is going to stay connected. And then one more thing that I did want to mention regarding the mirror modifier is you can actually choose a mirror object, and that is going to be the location of where the center of the mirror is. So on default, it uses the origin, which is that little orange dot. However, let's just go to the add menu by hitting Shift A. I'm going to add a cube and I'll scale the cube down and move it over here. Well, let's say that I wanted this object to mirror in the center of this object. What I could do is click on the eyedropper and then I could click on the cube. And this way, now when I move this object around, it's going to mirror from the center of this object. Now, if you're wondering where this could be useful, let's just say I'm modeling a basic car here. And then if I go to the add menu, let's just add like a cylinder. I can hit tab to go into edit mode and I can scale the cylinder down, and then I can scale it down. And then in object mode, I can bring it over here. I can rotate it and I can type X, and then I can type 90 and enter and just stick the wheel here. So now we have a car wheel. But let's say that I want to mirror it over. So if I click on add modifier, I can type in mirror and hit enter, but you can see the mirror isn't really showing up, and that's because it's mirroring it from the origin point, so I have to move it away from the origin. So you could do it that way, or you could click on the mirror object, so click on the eyedropper and choose the car, and now it's going to mirror it from the center of the car, and I could use the y-axis and the z-axis, and now I can just model one single tire, but it's going to mirror it in the center of the car. So if I move the car around, the center point is changing. So now I could like scale this out, maybe scale this out on the y-axis. I can go to the face select and inset this and extrude it back here, and I can add like some details to the tires, but because I'm using the mirror modifier, I'll only have to model one tire, and it's going to mirror it over to the other side of the car. So now that we've gone over the mirror modifier, which is like the most common modifier, let's go to another super common modifier, which is the subdivision surface. And this will basically smooth out your object and make it nice and smooth and kind of round out the edges. So to add the subdivision surface modifier, let's go to the add menu and we're going to add a new cube. Now, the subdivision surface modifier is so commonly used that there's actually a shortcut for it, and that is Control 2. And you're hitting the 2 on the top of your keyboard, not the numpad 2. The controlled numpad 2 won't work, but Control 2 on the top of your keyboard. And that is a shortcut key to add the subdivision surface modifier. But of course, you can also just click on add modifier. You can start to type in SUB for subdivision surface and add subdivision surface. surface. So when you add the subdivision surface, it's going to start to smooth out your geometry and kind of round the edges. But if I hit the tab key to go into edit mode, you can actually see the original geometry because again, modifiers are non-destructible, so they don't actually like affect the geometry of the mesh unless of course you actually apply the modifier like we applied the mirror. So if I clicked on the drop down and applied the subdivision surface, now if I go into edit mode, you can see these points are actual geometry. But if I hit just Control Z to undo that, let's just go back here. So with the subsurface on, we can still edit the cube, but then it's going to add the subdivision surface modifier after the original geometry. So as I mentioned, the subsurface is going to smooth it out. So basically what it's doing is it's doing like a calculation from this point over to this point, and then it's looking at this edge and seeing that this point and right here there's basically like a 90-degree edge. And so because of that 90-degree angle, it's starting to curve this around. So there are two different levels. There is viewport levels and there is render levels. So why there is viewport levels and render levels is because you might want to have the viewport levels be lower resolution so the scene doesn't get too laggy, but then when you finally render it, it's going to be a lot higher detail. So let's just click on these arrows here to turn up the viewport and render, and I can turn this up to like a 4. So now you can see it's smoothing this out so it actually looks more like a sphere instead of a cube, whereas before it's a cube, but with it turned on, it is more like a sphere. And that's because there's just a few points here, so it's basically smoothing out the angle from here down to here. Now there's also two options. There is Catmull-Clark and there is simple. So if you change this over to simple, it's not actually going to change the shape of the mesh, but it's still going to add the subdivision surface. So to show you what this is doing on the simple mode, I need to click on the drop down and apply the modifier. Now if I hit tab to go into edit mode, you can actually see the object actually has a lot more geometry because it subdivided it, so it basically cut out the mesh, but it didn't actually change the shape of the geometry. If I hit Control Z though to undo that, if I change it back to Catmull-Clark, it's going to do the same thing. So it still has the same amount of geometry, but it's going to round it out and smooth it out instead. Now what you can also do is you can sharpen up certain edges. So if I hit tab to go into edit mode, what I could do is add a loop cut here, and that way it would have a smaller value to smooth out, or a smaller amount to smooth. So if I hit Control R to add a loop cut, I can move my mouse here and then I can left click and then I can drag this around and then left click again. Also, I can double tap the G key, and double tapping the G key will use the edge slide and I can slide this over. So now you can see it's smoothing around over here because there's only like 4 vertices here, but right over here there is a vertex here, then a vertex here, and then a vertex right down here. So it's smoothing out, but it's much sharper on this side because it's going here and then it's going straight down. So instead of it being all the way over to the other side of the cube, it's quickly just moving down. So it's smoothing it out and it's much sharper. I can also hit Control R to add another loop cut. Let's left click and then drag over and then left click. And now you can see this edge here is a lot more sharp because there is more geometry there. So let's just continue to do that. So I'll hit Control R, left click, drag over, and then left click there. Control R, left click and drag over and left click again, and then Control R and drag this down here. So now that we have much more geometry around the cube, the edges look smooth. So it's still definitely smoothing it out. You can see the edges are round, but it's a lot more sharp on the edges. Another object where this will be useful in an example is if I hit Shift A, and we can go here to Mesh and I can add a monkey. So this is the Blender Suzanne monkey head. So you can see this object is like very sharp and maybe I want to smooth it out. Well, one thing that you might be familiar with, if you're familiar with 3D modeling, is to use the object context menu and shade an object smooth. And so that's going to make the faces really smooth. But the problem with this is that the monkey head still looks really blocky. You can see like on the top of the eyebrows, it's really blocky, and around the ear. So I could of course like go into edit mode and try to like add more geometry, or I could use a subdivision surface. So if I type in add subdivision surface, if I go into edit mode, you can see there still is the original geometry, but it's adding a lot more detail there. And I can of course change the viewport levels and the render levels. So now you can see the entire monkey head looks really nice and smooth. So the next modifier that I want to show you is the bevel modifier. So if I hit Shift A for the add menu, let's just add a new cube. And so the bevel modifier is going to smooth out just the edges. So what I can do is click on add modifier and search for bevel by typing typing B and E, and then there we go, Bevel Modifier. Now you can see on default, the Bevel Modifier is quite large, but what it's going to do is basically add another face here where this edge is. Now there's a few settings. There is the amount, so I can change the size of it. So if I make it really big, I can kind of get like a really cool effect. I can make kind of like a pyramid shape. Normally a bevel is used to be really small on the edge. So when you look at things in the real world, look at pretty much any object, even like the side of a room or like a door or really any other prop or object. If you look at the very corners, pretty much every object is going to have a tiny little bit of smoothing. So for example, if you were modeling like a simple phone, maybe you're modeling like a smartphone, like 3D model or something, let's just like scale this like that. But you can see if I didn't have the bevel, this edge would look super, super sharp. And so especially if you're trying to do a realistic 3D model, that edge really isn't going to look good, especially in the reflections, because it's just way too sharp. Because every object, pretty much every object in the real world has a tiny little bit of a round edge. So if you add the bevel modifier, you can turn this amount way down just to a really small number, and that will just add that little bevel to the edges. And then what I can do is turn up the segments. So I can click here to turn up the segments. So I can just turn up the segments maybe to like a 3 or 4, and now that's going to round out that edge there. And then I can use the object context menu and shade it smooth, and now just that tiny little edge there is a little bit smooth, and you can kind of see that little reflection there in the matte cap. Now if I drag this amount up just to kind of show you what this is doing, let's just shade the object flat again. You can see this is what the segments is doing. So when you add more segments, it's going to add more of those faces on the edge. So you definitely don't want to turn up too high because it will get too laggy and the object is going to be way too high geometry. But usually for most things, I just turn it to like a 3. So just turn it to a 3 and then just turn the amount way down, and then you could just shade it smooth. Now there's also this other option here, which is the limit method. So to show you what the limit method does, I'm going to delete the object and I'm going to add a new cylinder. So now I want to add a bevel to this because maybe I'm modeling like a glass or a cup or something. We can actually do that just by going into edit mode, scaling everything up, go to the face select and just like scale this face up a little bit. Then we can hit the I key to inset the face, and then the E key to extrude the face and bring it down on the Z axis, and then just hit S to scale that down, and then go back to object mode. So we just have a very simple cup. But let's say that I want to just add a bevel to this because it's way too sharp. And also if I try to shade the object smooth, the problem with shading it smooth is it just looks really flat and weird because there isn't enough geometry. So let's shade it flat again. What I can do is click on add modifier, and I can add the bevel modifier. And then I can turn the segments up. Again, let's just go with like a 3, and I can drag the amount down. And also if you hold down the shift key as you're dragging the amount value, that's going to make your movements a lot more sensitive. So you can see right now it's kind of a little bit hard to get the amount exact, but if I hold down the shift key, now the movement is going to be more sensitive. And then I could, for example, just shade the object smooth. So now we have a cup there and it looks a lot more sharp and crisp, and there's a nice bevel there. I could also turn the amount up if I want to be a lot more round. Now what the angle limit is doing is it's only adding the bevel to an edge which is at a certain angle, and that's the angle that we can specify here. And on default, it's actually already doing that, and that is super useful because we wouldn't want to add a bevel to all of these different vertical lines. So if I hold down the Z button and go into wireframe and zoom in here, you can see it's adding the bevel. There it is before and there it is after. So it's only adding the bevel to this, and that's because this here is about a 90-degree angle. This is actually a little bit larger than a 90-degree angle. If I were to add like a cube would be exactly 90 degrees because that's 90-degree angle, whereas this is a little bit farther than 90 degrees because it's kind of caving down in. So the angle limit is what angle is it going to apply the bevel to. So if I just go into wireframe, let's just say I wanted the bevel to be on all of the edges. Well, I could turn the angle limit to 0, or I could also take the limit method and change it to none. And this way, now it's going to add that bevel to every single edge. So if I go into wireframe, you can see every single edge there has the amount of segments. But the problem with this is that now it kind of has these really weird sharp bits here, and most of the time that's not what you want, especially for like a cup like this. That just looks really weird. So instead, what I can do is take the limit method and I can turn it to angle, and then I can turn up the angle amount. And on default, it's at 30. If I turn it up to a really high value, like let's turn up past 90, now if I go into wireframe, you can see it's gotten rid of the bevel on this edge. And if I keep turning it up, now there's no bevel. So it's basically as if the modifier isn't even there. So the angle limit is very useful if you just want to add it to some pieces. So another example where it might be really useful is to add like a cylinder. Let's go into edit mode, we'll go to the face select and I can hit E to extrude and then S to scale and then E to extrude. So for example, maybe I'm modeling like a rocket ship or maybe I'm modeling like a bottle. Let's click on add modifier and I can add the bevel modifier. And you can see I've added the bevel and I can turn up the segments here, and now it's only going to add it to this edge, so it's going to round this out, then it's going to round this out, and then it's going to round this out. However, if I go into edit mode, let's just go into wireframe and I'm just going to box select all the faces. Just box select all these faces and go back to solid view. Once this goes up to a certain angle, like if I drag this right up here, you can see the bevel goes away. So now it looks really sharp there instead of smooth. Whereas if I bring it down, you can see now the bevel appears, and that's because of that angle. Well, if I just drag this up here, let's say I wanted to add a bevel here, I could just drag the angle limit down to a smaller number, and now it's going to have that bevel there. Let's just delete these objects, and the next modifier that I want to show you is the array modifier. So let's say you're modeling something which is going to be arrayed or duplicated next to each other. So one example that I can think of is like a railroad track. If you want to create like a railroad track, I actually have a tutorial on that. Link will be in the description. Maybe you'd also want to model like a picket fence or just some kind of fence object, or you also might want to model something like tank treads. Well, in all of those cases, you would have an object, but you'd want to array or duplicate the object and move it over, so they're all next to each other. So I'm just going to model a very basic fence. So I'm going to add a cube. Let's hit tab to go into edit mode. I can scale the cube down. Let's also scale it up on the z-axis. And then I can scale it down on the y-axis. So scale it down on the y. Then if I go to the face select and select this face, I can extrude it and then scale it down on the x-axis. And then what I can do is I can select this face. I'll hit Shift D to duplicate. I'll hit R to rotate, and then I'll type Y, and then I'm going to type 90 for 90 degrees and hit enter. And then I'll just scale it down on the x-axis. And then just to give it a bit of thickness, I'll hit E to extrude. I could also hit the L key with my mouse hovered over this piece and bring it down the z-axis, and then hit Shift D to duplicate and bring it up here. So now we just have one piece of the fence. Well, if I want to like duplicate this many times and have lots of different fence pieces, instead of duplicating the objects, I can add the array modifier. So we'll click on add modifier and I can add array. And you can see now it's arraying it here on the x-axis. And the point where it's going to connect is the very end of the geometry. So if I select these pieces and kind of drag it, that is where it's going to end. It's going to end, and then the next one is going to start at the very end of the geometry. So there's a count here, so I can turn up the count so I could make a really long fence. And then also there is the x-axis, there is the y-axis, and there is the z-axis. So if I just go into edit mode and rotate everything on the z-axis by 90 degrees, then this would be a problem because I want it to be moving out this way, not this way. So what I could do is take the factor x and type in 0, and then take the y and type in 1. And this way, it's now going to be arraying it on the y-axis instead. And then also you can see if I drag up the number larger than 0, there's going to be a space in between it. So if I turn the values to 0, it's going to be on top of each other. So we basically have a bunch of fence posts on top of each other. If I turn up the y-axis by just a very small amount, then they're going to be overlapping. And if I turn this up to a value of 1, they're going to be perfectly aligned. If I turn it larger than 1, there's going to be a space. And then you can actually use the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis all at once. So this way, it's moving up on the x, the y, and the z, so it's kind of moving up in this direction. So I'm just going to type back in 0 for all these, and I'll turn the y back to 1. Now another useful option is the object offset. So instead of it just being offset by this relative, you can actually choose an object to offset it by. So if I go to the add menu, let's just add like an icosphere here, and then if I select the fence, we can turn on the object offset, and we'll open this up by clicking the arrow. And if I click on the eyedropper, we can choose the icosphere. Now the icosphere is in the very center of the 3D scene, but if I bring it up on the z-axis, bring it over here, it's going to be offset by where the object is offset from its center point, or not the center point, but from the center of the world, or where it was originally located. So I can move it down here, kind of move that over, and then I can also scale it. And so because this object is scaled up, each one of the fences are going to be scaled up by that amount. I could also rotate this, and so each one is going to be rotated by the amount. So if I just hit R to rotate and type in like 20 and then enter, now this object has been rotated by 20 degrees. So each one of these are going to rotate by 20 degrees. And the next modifier that I want to show you is the skin modifier. So the skin modifier is basically going to add thickness to edges. So let's hit Shift A for the add menu. I'm going to add a plane. And then if we go into edit mode, we are going to scale the plane on the x-axis by 0 and then enter. And let's go to top view. So we squished it down by 0. So now we have overlapping vertices. So let's hit M. And we're going to merge by distance, so that way it merged the extra vertices. So now what I'm going to do is select a vertex and hit E to extrude, select this vertex again, E to extrude, and I'm just going to model like a very simple stick figure just by extruding out the vertices. So there is our very basic stick figure. So what I want to do is add thickness to this. So I'll click on add modifier and I can type in skin and just add skin modifier, and you can see it's going to add thickness to the object. Now to actually change the size of the skin thickness, you need to go into edit mode, so hit tab, and I'm going to go into wireframe and just hit the A key to make sure you select all the mesh. And then what you can do is hit Control A and you can drag your mouse and make it bigger or smaller, so I can make these stick figures kind of outlined thinner or thicker. So this is very useful for giving thickness to like a wireframe mesh. And then what I could do is like select the very center of the stick figure, like the torso, and hit Control A and just make that part thicker. And you could just make like the arms thicker or just make the body thicker. Now later in this video I am going to be talking about like stacking different modifiers on top of each other, so you have multiple modifiers. But let's say that I want to smooth this out because it's kind of blocky right now. Well, we already talked about the subdivision surface, so if I click on add modifier and search for subdivision surface modifier, you can now see that we first are using the skin and then we're subdividing it. So it's making it thick and then it's smoothing it out. And then I can just shade this smooth and also like turn up the count here. Now you can see if I try to shade this smooth, the skin modifier won't actually shade it smooth, and that's because you need to click on smooth shading. So now we just have a stick figure and he is nice and smooth. And I actually have a separate tutorial where I show you how to create base meshes using the skin modifier, and you can create base meshes for sculpting. So if you want to watch that tutorial, I'll have the link in the description. Now the next modifier that I want to show you is the Boolean modifier. Now the Boolean is going to cut into another mesh. So let's just go to the add menu and I'll add a cube, and then we'll go to the add menu again. I'm going to add another cube and I'll bring this cube up. So we now have 2 cubes. So let's say that I want this cube to cut into the other cube. Well, if I select the original cube, let's click on add modifier, and I can add the Boolean modifier. And then here on the Boolean, I need to choose an object that I want to cut into the other object. So if I click on the eyedropper, I'm going to choose this second cube. Now you can kind of see it already taking effect with the wireframe, but let's just select this cube and press H to hide it. So it's hidden from our view, but it's still going to affect the Boolean. Now the Boolean has 3 different types. There is difference, which is actually going to cut into the mesh. So if I hit Alt H to unhide it, if I go into wireframe, you can see as I drag this around, it's actually cutting into the mesh, and I can adapt it and kind of move it around. And because I haven't applied the modifier, it's still going to affect the object as I move it. Let's just hit H to hide that object and go back to solid view. So again, there is difference, which is going to cut into the mesh. There is union, which is going to join both of them together. So these are going to be joined together into one mesh. Or there's intersect, which is just going to show you the stuff which is in between both of them. So for most things, you want to probably use difference. That's the one that you're probably going to use the most. And then if you want to apply it, you can click on the drop down and click on apply, because again, if you go into edit mode, this is still geometry because we haven't actually applied it. So if I click on the drop down and just apply this, now when I go into edit mode, the Boolean modifier has been applied. So now we have those cuts there. Let me just hit Control Z to undo that, because there's one more thing that I want to show you. So if I hit Alt H to unhide the object, let's select this cube, and let's say that you want to see the effect of the cube. So what I can do is select the Boolean cube, and then I can click right over here to go to the object properties. Then what I can do is I can open up the viewport display, and on this display as, there is textured, but let's click on this and change it to wired instead. So it's basically acting like a wireframe. So now I can move this around and you can actually see how the Boolean is taking effect. Or let's just change it to union. So if I just click on the object again and go to the modifier properties, which is the wrench icon, I can change it to union. And now this is what it'll look like if they're joined together. So they're basically going to be one object. Or I can change it to intersect. And so intersect again is only going to show it where both of the objects are overlapping. And I actually have a larger video, it's a longer video about the Boolean modifier, so if you want to check out that tutorial, the link is in the description. Another useful modifier is the wireframe modifier, which will turn your object into a wireframe. So let's go to the add menu and I can just add like a monkey head. And let's say that I just want to have a wireframe preview of the monkey head. Well, if I click on add modifier, I can type in wireframe and you can see now it's just going to give me a wireframe. So it's basically adding faces along the edges, but then where the original faces are, that's going to be invisible. So it's going to get rid of the faces and then just where the edges are, it's going to add that wireframe effect. So there's a thickness, so I can make it really thick or really thin. And there's also a few more settings, but the thickness is the main one that you'll use. Now, why this could be useful is if you're creating like a cool wireframe render. So I could just select the object and hit Shift D to duplicate, and then hit Escape so it stays where it is. And then I can hit the Exit button to get rid of that modifier. So we now have the original monkey head and then the wireframe monkey head. And so now we can just see the wireframe on top of the monkey head. And I also have a separate video on how to create wireframe renders. If you want to check out that video, the link is in the description. And in that video, I actually show you some other methods for adding wireframes. Like you can add the wireframe here on the viewport display to actually see the wireframe of the mesh. So you can now see the wireframe. But this is also another useful way to show the wireframe, especially if you want the wireframe to show up in the render, because the wireframe is actual mesh with thickness. So let's just delete this object, and the next modifier that I want to show you is Solidify, and this is going to make faces solid. So if I just go to the add menu and add a plane, let's now click on add modifier and I can add Solidify. And so you can see as I turn up the thickness, that is going to make it solid. So where this is really useful is if you have some sort of object that you need to add thickness to, like for example, a glass cup. So if I delete the object, let's just add a cylinder. So Shift A, go to Mesh, add cylinder. Let's go into edit mode and I can go to the face select. I'm going to select this face and I'll hit G to grab and I'll bring it up on the Z axis. And then I can scale this up a little bit so we have just a simple glass object. And then I'm just going to delete the faces. So I want to add thickness to this glass because right now it's perfectly thin and that's not realistic. What I can do is click on add modifier and add Solidify, and then I can just drag the thickness. And then as I talked about earlier, you can also like stack modifiers. So for example, after adding Solidify, I could also add like a bevel modifier. Let's add a bevel. And then on the bevel settings, if you scroll down here, let's actually click on the arrow just to minimize this. I can turn up the segments. I can turn down the amount like that, and then I can shade it smooth. So you can see before we just started with this very plain object, but we're giving it thickness and then we're adding a bevel to it. So now it actually is a cup with thickness. So the next modifier that I want to show you is the Shrinkwrap modifier. So to demonstrate the Shrinkwrap modifier, I've just modeled this very basic mushroom. If you do want to learn how to create a mushroom in Blender, I have a few different tutorials. I have some magical mushrooms. I also have like some glowing mushrooms. So if you want to check out those, a link will be in the description. And so what I want to do is I want to create like some little blobs here to look like little spots on the top of the mushroom. So what I'm going to do is go to the add menu. I'll go to mesh and I can add a circle, and I'll just bring the circle up and I will hit tab to go into edit mode and I'll scale the circle down, and then I will hit the F key to fill a face. So what I want to do now is basically shrink wrap this onto the mushroom, because right now I could like move it around, kind of stick it on here, but it's not really like rotating with the shape of the mushroom. And so I want it to be like flattened there on the mushroom. So with this piece selected, I can click on add modifier and I can add shrink wrap. And now you can have an object to choose. So I'm going to click on the eyedropper here and I'm going to choose this mushroom. So now if I hit G to grab and try to move this object around, you can see the object is being shrink wrapped. So it's basically being plastered right on to the mushroom. Now there's a few settings. So one setting that I like to change is the on surface, and I like to change this to above surface for most things. And that will just act a little bit better. And then I can also change the offset. So I can drag this up. So now it's basically just like floating over the surface. Now a problem with this is that it doesn't actually have very much geometry, so it's not kind of rounding in a circle. Like if I move this up here, you can see it's not really rounding around of the mushroom. So if I hit tab to go into edit mode, I can hit the I key to inset a face there, and then hit I, and then I, and then I, and just do that a few times. So if I go back to object mode, now there's much more geometry, so you can see it's actually rounding around with the shape of the mushroom. And I find it's a little bit easier to do this in edit mode because I can actually see the shape of the geometry. So I can just have this just slightly above, and now it's going to shrink wrap down. Now another problem is that it's floating over the surface. So again, just like I talked about before, we can stack modifiers on top of each other. So if I click on add modifier, I could type in solidify, and then I could take the solidify thickness and drag that down just like that, and then maybe drag the offset, so the offset value of the shrink wrap, and then I could also just shade the object smooth. So now you can see we just have a little like circle there, and if I go into edit mode, I can hit Shift D to duplicate, hit the R key to rotate it, S to scale it, Shift D to duplicate it, and then R to rotate, S to scale, and I can just kind of place all these little circles here on the mushroom. And so that kind of looks like those little like circles there on like one of those classic like red and white mushrooms. And if you do want to learn how to create a mushroom like this, then I actually have a tutorial series that I created quite a while back. It was one of my very first tutorial series on how to create like a mushroom forest scene. So it's a pretty old video, but you can still follow it if you want to check it out. Link is in the description. Now there's one more modifier that I want to show you, and that is the Lattice modifier. So for example, I can go to the add menu and add like a monkey head. And the lattice modifier is used to deform another object. So what I'm going to do is click on add modifier, and I'm going to go to the search and type in sub and add subdivision surface. And I can just turn the subdivision surface way up. And then if I click on the drop down, I can apply the subdivision surface modifier. So that way it's all geometry. So if I hit Shift A, I can go down here to lattice and just add the default lattice object. And I'll just scale it up. So right now the lattice basically looks like a cube. So to actually use the lattice, I can click on the monkey head, and I can click on add modifier, and I can start to type in lattice, and I can add the lattice modifier. So now if I click on the eyedropper, the modifier wants to know what lattice it's using. So if I click on the eyedropper, I can click on this lattice. Now if I select the lattice and hit tab, I can select the vertices in the lattice, or these points here, and I can drag this around, and this will very nicely and very smoothly edit the mesh. So basically whatever part of the mesh is closest to that point of the lattice, it's going to pull that around. Now you can actually add more geometry or more detail to the lattice. So if I click on the lattice data properties by clicking here, I can turn up the U, V, and W. So I'll just turn these up, maybe turn them up really big like that. And then if I hit tab to go into edit mode, I can like hold down the shift key and select these points, and I can scale the points, I can rotate the points, and I can move them around. So for example, I could just like select all of these points here, and I could maybe like scale them up and bring them forward. And now the monkey head really has this funny expression. I could also like box select this side, and then hit B for the box select this side, and I could maybe scale this out, maybe bring it out and bring it up. And now the monkey has these funny ears which are just shooting away. And another reason why this is so useful is because it's not actually messing up the geometry. So if I hit tab to go into edit mode, the geometry is still the same, so this isn't set in stone. So if I wanted to, I could just delete the lattice and the monkey head would go back. Now there are definitely some more things you can learn about the lattice modifier. So if you want to learn more about the lattice modifier, I have another video on that if you want to learn more. So link to that video is in the description. Now if the object scale isn't applied when you have a modifier, it might make the modifier act a bit weird or mess it up. So for example, let's scale the cube up a lot, but then let's hit Control A and apply the scale of the object. Well, you can see because I applied the scale, you can see the modifier got a lot smaller because Blender now realizes that the cube is just a really big cube, so the bevel needs to be smaller. If I just scale the cube way down and then hit Control A and then apply the scale again, now you can see the bevel is actually the same size. If I duplicate this and scale it up and apply the object scale, you can actually see if I compare these, the amount of bevel is actually the same because the amount is the same. But because the object scale is applied, this one is going to be bigger or this one's going to be smaller compared to the size of the object. So just keep that in mind that if you scale the object and then apply the scale, it might change or affect the modifier. Now, as I've been talking about, you can actually stack modifiers on top of each other, and this can be very powerful. So let's just go to the add menu and let's just go to mesh and add a monkey. So let's say that I wanted to maybe make the monkey's ear bigger on both sides. So I can go into edit mode, go to wireframe, and go to the vertex select. I can deselect everything and then just box select half of the monkey and just delete the vertices. So now if I click on add modifier, I can search for mirror and add the mirror modifier, and then I can turn on the clipping button so it merges with the mirror. This way, if I just like box select the monkey's ear, and let's just scale it up a little bit, let's actually hit the O key to turn on proportional editing, and then I can scale this up and it's going to scale the other vertices around it. So now the monkey head has like really big ears. Then another cool thing we could do is smooth it out. So let's click on add modifier. We could add the subdivision surface modifier. So now it's going to smooth it out, and I could just shade this smooth. Let's turn up the levels viewport and render up to 2. But then let's say I want to add a cool wireframe effect. So I could click on add modifier and I could type in wireframe. And now you can see we have this really cool wireframe effect to the monkey, and I can like drag the thickness of the wireframe, something like that. And then this might make your computer a bit laggy, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, but let's just turn the levels viewport and render down. And then what I can do is click on add modifier and I can add another subdivision surface. And so you can see it's taking a while to load up. My computer's kind of lagging, so I don't necessarily recommend that because it might get a little bit laggy. So now you can see we have the mirror, then we are subdividing it, then we're turning it into a wireframe, and then we're subdividing the wireframe. And I can maybe turn the subdivision surface up to like 2 so it's really smooth. So now you can see we get this really, really cool effect with all of these little circles. And so you can stack modifiers on top of each other and get some really cool effects. Now, stacking the modifiers in their correct order is very important. So for example, if I go to the add menu, let's just add a plane, and let's say that I wanted the plane to be mirrored on the other side. So I'll hit tab to go into edit mode, and I'll bring it over here over to this side, and I can turn off the proportional editing. So now let's say that I want to kind of smooth out the plane. So what I can do is click on add modifier and add subdivision surface to kind of smooth it out. We'll turn up the levels viewport. So now you can see it's a nice smooth plane, but I want to mirror it over to the other side. So I'll click on add modifier and I can add the mirror modifier. So then I can hit tab to go into edit mode and I can drag it together, and then I can turn on the clipping button and drag it out. So you can see it is connecting, but for some reason, this part of the geometry isn't connecting with this part of the geometry. And that is because of the modifier stack. So it starts from top and then goes down to bottom. So it first subdivides it, and then it adds the mirror. However, if I wanted the mesh to be joined together, what I would need to do is click on these little dots here and drag it up and drop it here. And so this way, it is first going to add the mirror modifier. So here's what it looks like with just the mirror. So we're just adding a mirror modifier to the plane, and then I add the subdivision. So now just these edges are smooth. So you can see the difference between the subsurf first or the mirror first. So if for some reason you're having trouble with the modifiers and something isn't looking correct, you might need to go back and kind of look at the modifier stack and just think about the order in which you're ordering the modifiers. So that's the very basics of object modifiers in Blender. So you now know how to use all of the basic modifiers, and you can use all these modifiers to really help you out with your 3D modeling. So I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to download the free project files, this Blender file with all of these different examples will be in the Blender file. So I'll have a link in the video description. You can download it for free on my Gumroad store or my Patreon page. And if you are downloading on Gumroad, you can just punch in 0 into the price box and then download for free. Or if you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful and you'd like to help support me and this channel, you can punch in a few dollars into the price box before purchasing, and that's a great way to send me a tip and help support this channel. You can also check out my Blender Beginner Fundamentals tutorial playlist to learn more fundamentals in Blender. And if you are a beginner to Blender, I highly recommend checking out my Blender for Complete Beginners tutorial series. So I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you for watching.